NUFC Talk Radio.
The voice of the Toon Army. Live daily on the website, on YouTube,
on DAB,
and on every online radio directory.
NUFC Talk.
The voice of the Toon Army.
Hello, you are listening to NUFC Talk Radio. My name is Daniel Wales, and once again we are back with your weekly Inside the Press Room show here live on NUFC Talk Radio. Thank you to everyone that is tuning in or will tune in during the rest of this hour between 4 and 5 p.m. Slightly earlier than we were last week, of course. That was 5:30 till 6:30, but today we are here 4 till 5. And what a show we've got lined up for you today. We'll be discussing the fallout from Newcastle United's defeat in the FA Cup against Manchester City, what was said in the press room after that, looking at the press conference with Eddie Howe, and then, of course, we'll be looking at what happened in the aftermath of that 1-1 draw against Barcelona. Well, what a game that was as well. Thank you to Lynn already getting involved in the comments. Smash the likes, please do that. That would be greatly appreciated if you do that whilst you're watching here today. Thank you all for everyone who is listening live on DAB or watching live here on YouTube. So, as I say, today we have quite the show, as I say, talking about Manchester City, Barcelona, and we've got a great guest joining us later on in the show, and that is the Daily Mail's chief football reporter, Craig Hope. We've got him live on Inside the Press Room here on NUFC Talk Radio, so we'll be speaking to Craig later on. We've got another comment coming in. Hello, Chapwell. Hello to you as well. Clacky Steak Bakes. That is an interesting name, but I like it as well. Steak Bakes, indeed. How very Geordie. Anyway, we'll get straight into things. And after this short break, we will be dissecting what happened in that loss against Manchester City. Looking at the press conference after that game in our section called Press Conference Probe. And of course, then we'll get on to the rest of the show as well. But after this short break, we'll be looking at Manchester City.
You are listening to
NUFC Talk Radio.
the voice of the Toon Army. Live daily on the website, on YouTube,
on DAB,
and on every online radio directory.
NUFC Talk.
The voice of the Toon Army.
And just before we get into that as well, please do like, subscribe, and consider becoming a member if you are watching on YouTube. And if you're listening on DAB, thank you for tuning in as well. This should be a really good show on Inside the Press Room for NUFC Talk Radio and NUFC Talk TV on YouTube. But let's get straight into that loss in the FA Cup against Manchester City. 3-1 was the final score at St James's Park. And, well, it was disappointing, I think, to say the least. Newcastle, of course, they took the lead in that game. Early on, they were battering Manchester City. Watching from the press box, I should say, Newcastle took the game to Manchester City. I wrote that in my report that I was doing at the time, that they had, Manchester City weren't playing with their usual swagger at all. Newcastle were taking the game to them, closing down the spaces. And of course, the goal comes from Harvey Barnes. It's a great finish past James Trafford as well, and that makes it 1-0. But of course, we all know what happened after that. Newcastle, well, they imploded, as they have done on so many occasions, having taken the lead in games this season. Hello to Reluctant Gamer, who is commenting in the chat as well. Thank you for watching today. Yeah, it was disappointing, wasn't it? Just how easily Newcastle started to drop 10 yards back. And I mean, the way I looked at it is, I thought, well, Manchester City were always going to come back into the game. They always were, because that's Manchester City. Pep Guardiola's sides are too good to not come back into the game. But I think it was disappointing, the fact that Newcastle just simply couldn't get out. They couldn't get a hold of the ball, and they were just hoofing it long. And Manchester City were just coming back straight away. And ultimately, when the equaliser came, it felt like it was coming. Now, of course, they got to the byline, put a ball in. Lewis Hall failed to clear the ball, and it actually just sort of hit Savinho at the back post. That was perhaps the disappointing part of that goal, and it just sort of ricocheted off him a little bit. Aaron Ramsdale scrambling, couldn't quite keep it out. Never mind, of course. You thought 1-1, half-time, the tie is still there for them. Before we get into what happened next, thank you to Lee for joining. Thank you to Harple Calcy for saying proper journalists around here. Well, I do hope so. I do hope so. Craig will be making an appearance later on. I should point out that part of it will be pre-recorded because Craig is a busy man, and that he can't always appear live on these things. But we do have a chat with him later on. Yeah, smash the like button. Thank you very much. You're right. I am not indeed Craig Hope. You're not wrong there. I'm not Craig Hope. I am Daniel Wales. But as I say, we will be chatting to Craig Hope later on during this show. Let's have a look at this one. We played with 100% determination against Barca, but not against City. I think you're right. I think that's true. But I can understand why that was the case. And Craig mentions this later on as well, because I think Newcastle's squad is in a place now where, let's be honest, they just can't compete on all fronts constantly, whether that be with injuries and the fact that Manchester City's squad is just, it's just got a lot more depth than Newcastle's, and that's just the way it is. In fact, a lot of the talk, as we'll come on to in Press Conference Probe, was about the gulf between the two clubs as where it stands now, because there is a huge gulf between the two clubs in terms of the money that's been spent, in terms of the players that they have. And I think that Newcastle fans just need to sort of accept that a little bit. And it's a shame because, of course, the FA Cup was a route back into Europe, but that's gone now. But Newcastle and Manchester City just aren't at that same level at the moment. They have a much deeper squad with a lot more quality in perhaps their second string 11 than Newcastle have, and that's just the way it is. And Newcastle will take a lot of years to bridge that gap. And of course, the second goal, Marmoush, again, the ball gets to the byline, delivered back in, and then a bit of a scramble, and then he puts it into the net, and then his second goal, and Manchester City's third, is a strike from range, which I think it showed a little bit of tiredness, a little bit of fatigue, that he was allowed so much space in and around the edge of the box and able to pick one out and put it in the top corner. But let's get on to Press Conference Probe now, the main part of looking at the Manchester City loss, and see exactly what Eddie Howe said in the post-match press conference after the defeat against Manchester City. He was first asked about having no complaints about the result against Manchester City, and he said, yeah, no complaints on the result at all. We were beaten by the better team on the occasion, and that was a tough 45 minutes at the end. And I think I completely agree with Eddie Howe in that regard. Newcastle, let's be honest, do I say they prioritised other games to come? Probably, yes. They did try to win that game against Manchester City, no doubt about it. They had to try and win it because it was a big game in itself. But let's be honest, Barcelona was a bigger fish to fry. And with the squad that Newcastle have, the injuries that they have, and with, of course, Sunderland to come, Chelsea to come, and Barcelona again to come, that was perhaps the game that they had to make changes. And as heartbreaking as that is, and as I say, they did try and win, they just couldn't cope with it, and they had to eventually accept defeat in that game. And that's just the way it is. But yeah, let's have a look through some of the comments. I think we started in fifth gear, whereas Man City started in first, hence our goal. You could see them say that is true, yeah. And as I say, I think Newcastle eventually just had to accept the fact that Man City got better in that game, and Newcastle were trying to conserve a bit of energy, and they knew that they had Barcelona to come, and just how big that game was going to be in midweek. So yeah, I can see exactly the thoughts and the comments in the comment section coming up. That is the way it played out. But Eddie Howe certainly had no complaints following the full-time whistle. He was then asked on the gulf between the two clubs, and he said to that, you can see the strength and depth that they have, referring to Manchester City, and that this occasion was probably a step too far for Newcastle. And I think it was. They'd exerted so much energy beating Manchester United by 2-1 with 10 men, because of course Jacob Ramsey sending off, and they knew they had Barcelona to come, and so I think they couldn't push themselves anymore, in this game against Man City, given what had gone before and what had to come as well. And then came my two questions to Eddie Howe, and I want to go on this as well, because obviously there's the gulf between the two clubs now, but I focused on Newcastle aspiring to be like Manchester City in years to come. I asked Eddie Howe, Newcastle clearly have ambitions of being an elite club, and David Hopkinson's outlined the 2030 goal and 2030 vision to come. And so is Eddie Howe still confident that Newcastle will reach that long-term aim? And he sort of deflected it a little bit. He said that they are long-term questions and that my focus is really the short-term. But he did produce the quote from my question that has been talked about with regard to the Barcelona game coming up all week long. He said at the end of that answer, we have the biggest game in the club's history coming up. And that came from my question about aspiring to be like Manchester City and sort of looking at here in the short term and not in the long term. That is where that came from. It was my question, how that came up. So at the time when he said it, I actually was a bit taken slightly aback, but then I think quite quickly I realised what he meant, in the sense that clearly they were looking to prioritise the Barcelona game. And I think that as much as they did try to win against Man City and they went at it for that first 20 or so minutes, once Man City went through the gears with the quality that they have in their squad, it was always going to be a case where Newcastle were hanging on and trying not to concede, and ultimately it did happen and Man City won. And disappointing though that may be, Newcastle conserved enough energy to put out what was a stellar performance against Barcelona. So my other question to Eddie Howe was about a message to supporters at this stage of the season, in terms of getting them riled up and saying that this season can still be successful in terms of what could be achieved in the Champions League and the Premier League to come. Now, I see this in the comments here in the league. I think we are knackered. Well, we'll come on to that soon enough. We will come on to that. His message to supporters, Eddie Howe, was that the supporters were incredible today against Man City, and that this is a really unique football club full of incredible people, and we're going to need every single person that enters the stadium on Tuesday against Barcelona to try and make the difference for us. And I certainly believe that is what happened. Against Barcelona, the atmosphere was incredible. From where I was sat in the press box, it was brilliant. Certainly the crowd turned up and they delivered, and the players on the pitch, they delivered against Barcelona. But we will get into that with a bit more detail in the sections to come. But that was what was said against Man City in the post-match press conference. So just out of interest, what do you make of all those comments, especially the biggest game in the club's history, that quote in particular? Because that was branded a lot around the press, the media, in response to that question that I put to Eddie Howe. What are the thoughts in the comments when Eddie Howe said that? Do you think that was right that he said that, in terms of riling everyone up for such a game? Because I can understand why he did it. I think it was perhaps right to say something like that, in terms of lifting the spirits and building this game up and making it, the spectacle that he wanted it to be, both for the players and for the supporters. There's a comment come here saying biggest in terms of money. That's true. It was, because progressing in the Champions League will undoubtedly increase the revenue that comes into the club. So you can't argue with that whatsoever. And so he had to make a point regarding that as well. But as I say, I'm interested to hear what the supporters think of this. Again, saying that this was the biggest exposure for revenue. Yeah, you're absolutely right. It was. But I think on top of that, it was big for the supporters. It was big for the players. I think just the whole spectacle of the whole occasion was big for Newcastle. Because let's be honest, how often do these nights come around for a club like Newcastle? The FA Cup comes around every season. These last 16 games in the Champions League come around. Well, let's be honest, for Newcastle, the last time they were at this stage of a Champions League campaign was in 2002-03, when they, of course, were in a second group stage of the last 16 of the Champions League. So it's been a long time coming for Newcastle, an occasion like this. So I can completely understand why Eddie Howe said what he said. And after this little break, we will be heading into looking at press conference probe with regards to the Barcelona game. So, in the meantime, please do like, subscribe, consider becoming a member, and thank you to everyone who is tuning in on DAB and on YouTube. But we'll be back after this short break.
You are listening to
NUFC Talk Radio.
the voice of the Toon Army, live daily on the website, on YouTube,
on DAB,
and on every online radio directory.
NUFC Talk.
The voice of the Toon Army.
Now, I just want to draw attention to this comment here. I think it's quite an interesting one. It's saying that Eddie Howe doesn't have the persona or personality to get the fans up. Not his fault, but just who he is. Now, that I can understand is true to an extent. Eddie Howe is not a man who really, for the most part, wears his heart on his sleeve, because he doesn't. He is cool, calm, and collected, and quite reserved at times as well. But I think that's why he used a quote like that at the time he did, to get the fans up, because let's be honest, as much as he didn't have to say it a lot and didn't have to say it in this, big, huge voice and bellow it out to the supporters, he put it in the press. And I think that's really quite key, because then it was in the media, and it was the quote that got used for the rest of the days leading up to the Barcelona game. And it got people talking, and it got the exposure, and it got the fans talking. It got the exposure on social media. It worked. It might not have been a rallying cry in the perhaps conventional sense, but it worked. So I think actually it was the right thing done by Eddie Howe in that moment to get the fans up. So as I say, I'm not sure what everyone else thinks of that, but I can completely understand why he said what he said. But anyway, let's get into the Barcelona game. What a game. What a night. I think that was just a phenomenal occasion at St James's Park. The fireworks on the East Stand were brilliant. The atmosphere was fantastic. It was just an occasion for the ages at Newcastle. And I'd like to first draw attention to Lewis Hall's performance, because wasn't he magnificent? Pocketing Lamine Yamal all night. A lot of the pre-match press conference, when we talked to Lewis Hall, had been about him coming up against Lamine Yamal and coping with, what is probably the best young winger in the world at the moment for Barcelona and for Spain. But Lewis Hall, he seemed a little bit unfazed, to be honest, in the press conference beforehand. And it just showed on the pitch. He was brilliant, absolutely fantastic. Not only was he really good defensively, but also offensively. When he won the ball back, he took players on in his usual style. But it wasn't just taking players on against any old club. It was taking players on against Barcelona and creating chances, playing balls through to Asula and Barnes, and getting past, Yamal and others as well, and putting balls into the box. And it was just the absolute complete all-round performance from a fullback. Everything you could have wanted from Lewis Hall on that occasion, and it sort of announced him on the European and indeed the global stage. I thought he was just absolutely phenomenal, and I actually thought that Lamine Yamal, coming on to the next point, was unbelievably lucky not to be booked, because it was a blatant body check on Lewis Hall. After Lewis Hall had won the ball back from Yamal's failed pass forward, Lewis Hall wins the ball, and he takes it, or he goes to take it past Yamal. He's beaten him all ends up. He's dropped the shoulder. He's put the ball past him, and it's a blatant body check. Yamal, he made no attempt to play the ball absolutely whatsoever. And I can't believe that the referee did not brandish a yellow card for such a foul, having given one to Sandro Tonali, by the way, for a free kick with minimal contact. I couldn't believe that was not given as a yellow card when I was sat there watching that. It was unbelievable. But that was just the way it was. And of course, because Yamal, if he had been booked, would have missed the second leg at the Nou Camp, or the Camp Nou, however which way you pronounce it. Looking at this comment here, Hall is our dream player. Don't say he's probably the best in the world, or Chris, Michael. Yeah, he is. To me, he is. Not only is he England's best left back and should be starting for the World Cup, he is one of the best fullbacks in the world at present, in my humble opinion. Anyway, though, let's get on to the goals. Harvey Barnes scores at the end, and you think Newcastle are going to hold on to a famous victory, but of course, then you've got the Yamal penalty goal, and it is what it is. Unfortunately, it's a tired leg, isn't it? That Malik Chow sticks out, but the atmosphere up to that point had been brilliant. Newcastle seemed to be actually seeing the game out okay. Obviously, they scored quite late anyway, and the atmosphere lifted off St James's Park. It was brilliant when the Barnes goal went in, but they just couldn't quite see it out. And, you can complain about, of course, the referee playing over time, but it is what it is. But Newcastle are still in it, and I think that is what is key. Absolutely key. Newcastle are still in this game. That's the view from the press room. I think after the game, that's how it was viewed, that Newcastle are still in the game, and that they can go to the Camp Nou and get something. And that's what I want to go on to next, because in this part of Press Conference Probe, I didn't actually speak to Eddie Howe after the game. I went to the mix zone and I chatted to Harvey Barnes. And he was adamant that Newcastle can go there and do it. And I don't see why not. They made a Barcelona side look very ordinary on Tuesday night. They were brilliant, Newcastle. Barcelona, let's be honest, they weren't as good as they had been back in September. And Newcastle made them look ordinary. Newcastle were the better side throughout. Barcelona had minimal half chances, if any, really. I think the only real chance I can remember them really having is one that went down the throat of Aaron Ramsdale when Trippier seemed as if he had gone down holding his groin. And then when Lewandowski poked a shot wide in the second half. But again, they didn't really test Aaron Ramsdale, did they? They didn't breach Newcastle's defence on too many occasions at all. Newcastle were the threatening side. Newcastle were the side with the momentum all the way through. The players acted, the fans acted, and it was just a special occasion that deserved a win for Newcastle, in my opinion. But let's look at what Harvey Barnes said, because I asked him 2 questions. I asked him about the rest of the season, in terms of not just the Champions League, but also the Premier League as well. And I said, Harvey, what can Newcastle still achieve this season? And does a performance like they put out against Barcelona just show that Newcastle can still be successful in the end of this season? And he said, yes, we've got a lot to play for. We need to make sure on all fronts we're there and we're performing at the top level. And crucially, he said, we'll be ready for it. He did admit that they've been inconsistent this season, and he admitted that it hasn't been good enough at times, but he said that we'll be ready for it. And I know they're just words, and you could argue they're just empty words because it's a generic answer, and he's always going to say something like that. But to me, you could see the look in his eyes, and you could see that they were gutted after not winning that game, and that they were going to go forward after this heartbreaking draw and really try and press on and use it as motivation, if anything. I then asked him about preparing for the games they got to come. Of course, they've got Chelsea, they've got Barcelona in the second leg, and then they've got the derby before the international break. And he said, it's tough. They come thick and fast, and you've just got to prepare and recover. There's been no rest, but it's what the lads want to do, and everyone is loving it. And I think that's really good to hear, because you could complain, you could say that everyone's tired and that we are just trying and doing our best. But the fact that they said everyone is loving it, I found that really telling. And I say this because, as I say, you could quite easily say it's been challenging. And he did say it's been tough. He admitted that. But the fact that the players are enjoying it and the players are doing it and they're going through it and they're trying their best. Yes, they lost against Man City. Yes, they couldn't quite hold on against Barcelona. But the fact that they're enjoying this and the will to succeed and the will to do everything is there. That was really telling for me. And as much as they couldn't quite hold on against Barcelona, I think that there are still positive nights and days to come for Newcastle this season. Anyway, though, that is what Harvey Barnes had to say following the Barcelona draw. Eddie Howe, from what I hear, because as I say, I caught the end of the press conference when I walked back into the press room. The mix zone isn't in the press room. When I walked back in, he was proud of his team. He was incredibly proud in terms of what they'd achieved on the night, in terms of how they'd played and the performance they'd put out. It was everything I think he had hoped for. It was everything that he had hoped for from the fans as well, in terms of the atmosphere. And it was reflected on the pitch, and just a shame that they couldn't quite get over the line as well. But that is football. And as I say, they are still in the tie on Newcastle. So that is the way football goes. But after this short break, you'll be hearing from myself and Craig Hope. So please do stay tuned for this, because we'll be going through the Man City game, we'll be going through the Barcelona game, and our thoughts again on what was said in the press conferences following them, and we'll be giving some predictions for the games to come. We'll be predicting Chelsea, we'll be predicting Barcelona and Sunderland. So please do keep tuning in on DAB, on YouTube, and please continue to comment, like, subscribe, smash the like button if you are enjoying this show so far. But after this short break, it'll be myself talking to Craig Hope.
You are listening to
NUFC Talk Radio.
the voice of the Toon Army, live daily on the website, on YouTube,
on DAB,
and on every online radio directory.
NUFC Talk.
The voice of the Toon Army. You are listening to
NUFC Talk Radio.
the voice of the Toon Army, live daily on the website, on YouTube,
on the AB,
and on every online radio directory.
NUFC Talk.
The voice.
You are listening to NUFC Talk Radio, and as you can see, we have been joined by the Daily Mail's chief football reporter, Craig Hope. Craig, before we get into any of it, how are you? How are you doing?
I'm good. Yeah, you normally find a couple of days after these big midweek games, there's a little bit of a lag, given you've worked until sort of 2 a.m, as we do now across multi-platform. And because Barcelona was such a big game and so much narrative to emerge from it. Yeah, it was a busy night, but a good night. Just a shame that it ended how it did right at the end there.
It was certainly gutting, that last sort of 30 seconds or so, but we'll come to that in a moment because we'll start with Manchester City, because that was the game that came first at the start of last Saturday, I should say. Now, that was an interesting one because there was certainly discussion in the press room, and I heard you say it, I thought it myself, that the FA Cup was a route back into Europe for Newcastle United this season, and that's gone now. So could you understand the way Eddie Howe set up in that game? Firstly, the fact that there were changes made, and perhaps he had one eye on Barcelona when approaching that game against Manchester City.
Yeah, I do understand it. Now, listen, in a utopian world, what happens is Newcastle make changes and they beat Manchester City, and then they make more changes again and they go and beat Barcelona. But they're not there yet in terms of their journey. But when it comes to prioritising one over the other, and this has been a debate which, you said, Daniel, it raged in the press room, and then again in the days leading up to Barcelona. Now I was okay with it, and why do I say that? And it was clear that Barcelona was the priority, given the spine of the team in terms of Byrne, Joe Linton and Anthony Gordon, was taken out for Man City. Well, the FA Cup comes around next year. It comes around the year after that, and it was there last year as well. This was literally against Barcelona. Knockout Champions League football, once in a lifetime. Never before have we had that at St James's Park. So I understand why Eddie Howe was drawn in by the romance and the possibility of that. Not to mention as well, the cold, hard finance. Now, if Newcastle make it to the quarterfinals of the Champions League, that financially is worth far more than actually probably qualification for next year's Europa League, whatever it bring. Now, I understand the flip side of the argument. Yes, the memory of the Carabao Cup last year, it's fresh there. It was wonderful. It was a brilliant day. And if you can recreate that in the FA Cup, okay, great. That would be, again, I go back to that, if you can have the best of all worlds, so be it. But Newcastle aren't there right now. And if it was between picking one or the other, I understand why Eddie Howe lent more towards Barcelona. As it turned out for me, it looked like the right call. It still might be the right call. Newcastle couldn't have played the way they did on Tuesday, which was fantastic, which was fast, which was furious, which was fun from the off, if they had played their very strongest team against Manchester City.
Yeah, no, I fully agree with that. With the squad they've got, with the injuries, there is that gulf. And that sort of brings me on to my next point, because a lot of the questions that were aimed towards Eddie Howe post Manchester City in that press conference were about the gap between the two clubs, that Newcastle are trying to bridge that gap. And, Manchester City are clearly an elite club with squad depth and with lots of funds that they've spent throughout the years. Newcastle aren't there yet. And so it was a case of asking Eddie Howe, sort of, will Newcastle bridge that gap? And also Pep Guardiola got asked similar questions as well. What do you make of that? And do you think that, because Eddie Howe was a little bit reluctant, I certainly asked him about it, he seemed a little bit reluctant to answer in terms of the long-term future of the club, because he's very much not out here on the day-to-day. But do you think that was the right line of questioning, and something that has to be looked at because of the gap between the two clubs?
Well, every time Newcastle play Manchester City, that topic invariably does come up. And I think what's happened over time is, if you go back 2 or 3 years, where Newcastle's journey was that steep ascent from 19th to 4th in the Champions League, and it was fair to assume then, given the trajectory, that Newcastle would, within 2, 3, 4 years, be on a par with Manchester City. It seemed as if the rocket ship was taken off. I've always said that what happened there was a little bit of a mirage, was a little bit of an illusion. This wasn't the arrival of a new super club powered by Saudi petrodollars. It was basically good coaching and some smart recruitment, brilliant coaching, in fact, and brilliant recruitment, and players who came in and did hit the ground running, who did improve, who did make an impact. So because of that, the journey from 19th to 4th was eye-catching, and we all assumed it would continue. What we've seen in the last 2 or 3 years is a little bit more wavy. It's bottomed out a little bit. Now, are Newcastle now, as we stand here today, in a much better place than where they were 2 or 3 years ago? maybe not, maybe a slight improvement, maybe a slight regression. That depends on your take on it. So the idea of Newcastle catching up with Manchester City now, for me, seems a little more distant than it did 2 or 3 years ago, is what I'd say. So when we ask Eddie that question, I think it's a fair question to ask. But I think you can tell by the tone of his answers that he realises they aren't on the coattails of City as a team, as a squad, as a club, as a whole entity, really. So, yeah, the idea of Newcastle being one of the best clubs in the world in 2030, it's right to aim for it. I think it's right to signal that ambition. Is it realistic? I would say not.
It's clearly from David Hopkinson, that, of course, and I get why he said that, because if you've got a target to work for, it makes perhaps people at the club have something to look at and aspire to. But obviously, as you say, it is a long way away, and I fully agree with that. Now, it was to one of my questions, I believe, that Eddie Howe brought out with regard to the Barcelona game after the loss at Man City, the biggest game in the club's history quote, which has been one of the quotes that's been sort of put back at him throughout the whole week. It's been had a lot of discussion. Now, again, that sort of goes back to the original question I put to you there, but I can understand what he meant by that. Certainly, in the sense that this is perhaps not going to come next season because of Newcastle probably won't get in the Champions League. So clearly, it's something that the club has been working towards. I think when he said it, from my point of view, it felt as if it was all building up to this sort of crescendo in his era here so far, and it's. I saw a post that Mark Gillespie put on Instagram, and he said, this is what the past 4.5 years have been working towards. It felt like that this was the moment for Newcastle because of what he said there, and that this is what everyone at the club had been working towards for the whole of the Howe tenure. Is that how you took it as well?
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. What is football if it's not about moments, about legacy, about legend? This was Barcelona at home now. I said this in one of my YouTube videos the other day. My dad had said to me he was disappointed with the selection. My dad's a Newcastle fan, disappointed with the selection against Manchester City because they could have gone through in the FA Cup and they could have got Port Vale in the next round. I was like, come on, it's Port Vale. This is Barcelona. It's the one name, the one opponent who conjures all those memories of Tino Asprilla, Keith Gillespie, magical nights that will never be forgotten. Again, I come back to that phrase, once in a lifetime stuff. So for Newcastle to have spent 4 years building towards that, and yes, it's a quirk of the calendar that they've got a huge game 3 days previous against Manchester City. But if it's a case of prioritising or focusing on one more than the other, and listen, they did try to win both games. They absolutely tried to win both games. But I understand Eddie Howe's reasoning and why he said in the answer to you, Daniel, that, yeah, this is the biggest game in the club's history. Did he mean that in terms of a scientific? I've been back through every single match, and I'm telling you what, guys, this is the biggest. No, he didn't. What he meant was it's the biggest for now. It's the biggest in his experience. And why shouldn't he say that? And goodness, the way the night played out, they were one kick away from it being one of the greatest nights in the history. And it still might, if that 1-1 draw gives them the platform to go on and win next week in Spain. So I've got no problem at all with that messaging. In fact, I think Eddie Howe coming out and saying what he did and issuing those rallying cries and doing so with the enthusiasm and the conviction that he did played into the evening and the night being as loud and as raucous and as brilliant as it was.
Yeah. Now, just before we get onto the Barcelona game itself, I wanted to mention Lewis Hall because, of course, he was the player put up in the pre-match press conference on Monday afternoon, and he went into the Barcelona game, and he seemed, to me at least, he had a quiet air of confidence about him when a lot of questions were directed towards him about Lamine Yamal because, well, of course, he was going to come up against him on the day. But of course, we all saw what happened on the occasion that Lewis Hall essentially didn't let Lamine Yamal out of his back pocket. That's how it played out. And I wanted to mention this because, of course, you're not just covering Newcastle United, Craig. You're also covering England a lot of the time these days. We've got an international break coming up in just a week and a half's time or so, and then of course we've got the World Cup in the summer where you'll be at. So I wanted to mention that because Lewis Hall has played for the senior team before, but when Thomas Tuchel came in, he's had those injuries, so he's not really had that recent experience at the Thomas Tuchel squad. But would you be mightily surprised if he wasn't included in a week or so's time?
Absolutely, yeah. I think Lewis Hall is guaranteed to be in the squad, especially as left back is a problem position. And we saw Thomas Tuchel came up to St James's Park at the weekend. I dare say that was to check on more than any other Lewis Hall. And, I was out in Albania last time. I think Nico O'Reilly played there didn't really take his chance. He's been used in midfield more of late at Manchester City. Jed Spence, don't think Thomas Tuchel's convinced there. Luke Shaw, another option. Well, last week at St James's Park, Man United v Newcastle in the audition of the England left-backs, Luke Shaw came out on top. Luke Shaw versus Lamine Yamal. Luke Shaw came out on top. So in answer to your question, Daniel, Luke Shaw, not only will he be in the squad, I expect he'll start at least one of those friendlies so Thomas Tuchel can get a good look at him. And why shouldn't he? Luke Hall, right? Luke Hall. Luke Shaw, who is it? Yeah, maybe there was a mix of the two. Lewis Shaw. Yeah, Lewis Hall will start one of those. Too many games, too many players. Lewis Hall will start one of those friendlies so Thomas Tuchel can get a really good look at him, and so he should. He's brilliant.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, that just comes back to the same adage as, that David Brent skit where it's just the football is never ending at the moment. And that's just how it feels with all the games that are constantly being played in the Northeast. But yeah, I just wanted to focus on Lewis Hall briefly there because, of course, I thought he was fantastic. And that was sort of a coming of age performance. We've seen him at Newcastle so far this season. He has been fantastic. But that, to me, announced him on the European, perhaps even the global stages, to just how good he is and how good he can be as well. But if we get into the Barcelona game as a whole, of course, as you say, Newcastle one kick away from another memorable night against Barcelona at St James's Park, and it was a cruel, cruel way to end. I think when we were all watching that in the press area at St James's Park. Now, I'm actually not a big fan of the press box at St James's Park. I think it's too low down. I like perhaps to be a bit higher up. I feel like you can't always read the game. But what you can see, though, and you can hear, is some of the reactions on the pitch. And you could just tell Barcelona, when the penalty was awarded, that they all leapt out of their coaching. All the coaching staff leapt out. They knew they hadn't deserved that draw that they ended up getting with Lamine Yamal scoring. It just felt so cruel on Newcastle's behalf, but it is a bit of a concern that these little individual errors, they keep happening. And it was a tired leg from Malik Chow, who had a good game up to that point. But that's the only concern, that these errors, they are a theme of the season, aren't they?
They are a recurring theme. Now, I deliberately watched back from 90 minutes onwards on Tuesday night to get a feel for what had gone wrong, and we were talking in the press room amongst ourselves afterwards, and there was an accusation Anthony Gordon giving the ball away, Joe Willock with a foul, Jacob Murphy hadn't been good enough in a moment. Oh, okay, all of those little individual isolated moments existed, but in the seconds before Barcelona pierce Newcastle and win the penalty, Newcastle have actually recovered to being a 4-5-1 system, and it looks pretty set. It's a brilliant pass from Rafinha into the feet of Dani Olmo, who is a class player. He's fresh on, and he's up against a tired player in Malik Chow. And it was a penalty. He did catch him. But what can they do to safeguard against these moments? Because as you say, they are repeatedly happening. I actually think on this occasion, there's just a little bit more mitigation, because it was really good play. It was a good pass, a good little bit of skill. But could Tonali have been better placed in the six? I don't know. It's something they're going to have to look at, and it's something they are looking at, because, as you say, it stretches back so long now that this isn't something new whereby they're having to sit down and think, okay, goodness, how do we get our heads around this? But it's so far something they haven't found a solution to, and if it continues, it is going to undo brilliant performances. You've got to go back to the start of the season, Arsenal, Liverpool conceding, late goals or goals at times when they are in front. So yeah, it's a problem, but it's one they haven't yet addressed.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. And as I say, I mean, obviously there's not that long left of it, so they haven't got loads of time to at least address it this season. But there is still possibilities this season in terms of what they can achieve. Now, getting on to the Barcelona game itself and the aftermath of it as well. I didn't actually go to the press conference. I went to see Javi Barnes in the mixed zone, and he made clear that Newcastle can go to Barcelona and get a memorable, famous away European result against the Catalan side. Now, what was said in the Eddie Howe press conference? Because as I say, I missed that. I was in the mixed zone, and did what he said correlate with what Harvey Barnes was saying?
Yeah, to be honest with you, it wasn't really thrown forward as much, because we'll have the chance to do that with Eddie either tomorrow or again out in Barcelona next Tuesday. So yeah, it was more reflecting on the night that was. He did say we're very much alive in this tie, but there was just, there was pride and there was contentment. Yes, there was frustration, disappointment at the late goal, absolutely. But I think on the whole, there was reassurance, there was satisfaction that everything he called on his players and supporters to deliver, they did deliver, and they absolutely did. You mentioned the press box there. We're sat right amongst it. You can see close up on the pitch the effort, the energy, the electricity that's rolling down from the stands, going back up into amongst the supporters, given what those on the pitch are delivering. So, yeah, you get to know a manager over the course of 4.5 years, and I could tell that Eddie was pleased with that performance, and I think he should be. I think he's got every right to be. But ultimately, the aim and the name of the game is to go through. There would have been far better place to do that at 1-0, but at 1-1, and you look at how a lot of English teams have fared this week. Goodness, Tottenham Hotspur, Liverpool, Chelsea, Manchester City, they'd all bite your hand off for a 1-1. So Newcastle aren't in a bad place.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that completely. As I say, 1-1, they've got every chance, and that's sort of where I want to bring this to sort of a head. Is we've got Chelsea at the weekend, and then you've got Barcelona midweek, and then you've got the derby. It's you know, we talk about these runs of games. It's just continue at the moment. You've got then, of course, a bit of a gap with the international break, but certainly, how would you look perhaps first at Chelsea before you then look at the two games to follow that? Because does Chelsea give the same sort of feeling as the Man City Cup game a little bit, given what's to come? Is that a fair comparison?
Yeah, it does now. It does, and that's in part because of Newcastle's league position. And yeah, 12th in the league, probably an acceptance they're not going to get back into the top 5 in terms of Champions League football this season. It's still important. It's still big. They've still got to try and recover that position to get Europa League football at least. But yeah, given Barcelona that quick turnaround, the travel, I do think we might see 1 or 2 protected on Saturday night at Chelsea. And again, to go back to everything we've already touched on, I would be okay with that. I do. I just think they've got a wonderful opportunity out in Barcelona against a Barcelona team who, let's be fair, you know, Newcastle made them look ordinary. They weren't great. This isn't a Barcelona team of old. They've got 3 or 4 outstanding individuals, but as a team, I think there's a little bit of a disparity between the very best and some of those in the middle order. So yeah, Newcastle can go there. They've got to believe, and they will be buoyed by that performance on Tuesday night when they were the better team. So to that end, yeah, I don't like saying this because it's a big game against Chelsea and I'm going down. It's live on the television. It's the Premier League, but it does just have that little feel of there might be bigger and better to come on Wednesday out in Spain.
Yeah. And that brings on the final question is I ask my guests for a prediction for the upcoming games. So there are 3 big games to come. We've got Chelsea, Barcelona and Sunderland. If you had to predict a rough scoreline for each of those, Craig, how would you see them going, given what we've just discussed there in terms of how each game might be approached by Newcastle?
I'm going to go win, lose, draw. The three time win, lose, draw. Which one of them am I predicting a win? Which one a draw? Which one a loss? Go on, I'll throw it back to you, and I'll tell you which.
I think it's going to be a loss at Chelsea, win against Sunderland, and draw at Barcelona.
And win on pens.
Yeah, because you said, you know what it is? I actually watched your vlog or your pre-match vlog from the cup final in March just a year ago now, and you said that Newcastle would go the distance then against Liverpool at Wembley. Didn't quite happen that way. It was actually a little bit easier in terms of Newcastle's perspective, but yeah, I'd say that I think they'll get beaten by Chelsea. I think they'll draw against Barcelona, and you'll never know what'll happen extra time there. And I think just because of what happened in December as well, they know they need to go and do a job against Sunderland.
I think they know they need to beat Sunderland. December was a real shock. I think it was a real moment of realization. I think they'll beat Sunderland because of all of that. Chelsea, for all the reasons we've outlined, it's just got a little bit of a whiff of a defeat about it. Tuesday, Barcelona. Well, do you know what? I like giving predictions because people are interested in it. It's a way of previewing a game. But on Tuesday, in terms of predictions, I don't think they're that important, really. It's just a brilliant occasion. Sorry, Wednesday coming up at the new camp, a brilliant occasion to go and enjoy. And if you're pushing me for one, why not a draw? Why not enjoy another half an hour of an extra time? And then why not enjoy, if you can, a penalty shootout? And what will be, will be.
Exactly, Craig. And that is a great way to end this little chat. I'll be back after the break on NUFC Talk Radio and Inside the Press Room. But until then, Craig, thank you very much for speaking to me.
You are listening to
NUFC Talk Radio.
the voice of the Toon Army, live daily on the website, on YouTube,
on DAB,
and on every online radio directory.
NUFC Talk.
The voice of the Toon Army.
Well, there we have it. That was my chat with Craig Hope, looking at the fallout in the press room after the Man City game and after the Barcelona game. They were two, contrasting occasions in terms of the result, of course, but that is just the way Newcastle is at the moment, going from huge game to huge game. Now, I've been reading some of the comments whilst that was on, in particular this one that's just come up now. It would be embarrassing, says Gaz. If Sunderland were to do the double over Newcastle in their first season back, can't happen. How we'll know about it if we lose that game. I'm quietly confident that Newcastle, as Craig has just said there, know the importance of the derby as well. Of course, they know Barcelona is huge, and they know the derby is huge as well. And I think given what happened at the Stadium of Light in December, Newcastle will approach that game and they will go forward against Sunderland and they will come out probably with a victory as well. Chelsea, I think, is probably the game where if they are going to lose one of these next three, that's going to be it. Barcelona, well, it is what it is. We'll see what happens at the Camp Nou. Newcastle may well just go there and pull off what would be a huge result. Shockwaves will be sent around Europe if they did that, of course. But we'll come to that in a moment. Let's preview Chelsea first. Of course, live on the television, as Craig said, 5:30 kickoff on Saturday evening. Now, I think perhaps it is fair to say that it is less of a priority than Barcelona and Sunderland. I'm just going to quickly pop into the comments quickly first as well. Is there any news on Bruno coming back soon? Bruno will probably not be back until after the international break and may even miss a week or two after that international break as well. I think that's the way it's looking, unless for some perhaps miracle recovery with his hamstring, I think it is. But yeah, I don't think Bruno will be back until sort of early to mid-April, which is a real shame. But that is just unfortunately the way it is with that injury that he sustained away at Tottenham. But going back to Chelsea, as much as Premier League games are running out, and they are, because Newcastle know they need to get back into Europe somehow, whether that's in the Conference League, whether that's in the Europa League, and that would be the case of finishing perhaps 7th or 8th. 7th could be good enough for the Europa League, depending on who wins the FA Cup, and 8th, depending on, well, the Conference League will come down into the league as well, because, of course, it's going to be Arsenal or Man City who win the Carabao Cup. So the Conference League will be 7th or 8th. I do believe that is the way it works in the Premier League. And then if a team already qualified for Europe in the Champions League wins the FA Cup, which is looking likely given who's left in it, then the Europa League will be 6th and 7th if England does keep that 5th spot for the Champions League. And then Conference League would be 8th. So that means that there is every chance that it is still possible for Newcastle to qualify for some form of Europe via the Premier League. So, yes, games are running out, but I think Chelsea, again, it's a game where perhaps they don't, I'm not saying they don't need to win. Of course, they will go and try and win that game. It's Newcastle, it's Eddie Howe. They will try and win that game. But I think that it's less of a priority than what is to come after that. Now, I've got a comment coming in here from Harmeet, and he says, "How out?" Now, Harmeet, I'd like to know why do you think that? Because as much as some people may disagree with me, I'm still very much Howe in at Newcastle, and that is my opinion formed on chatting to him in the press room and understanding some of the factors mitigating this season and trying to form a balanced view in terms of what's happened this season and what could still be to come this season as well. So I'm interested to hear why that is your view. Please do reply in the comments if you've got a sort of a thought on that and an explanation as to what your thinking is. In fact, I'd open this up to everyone. What is the view on Eddie Howe at the moment? Because I can certainly give my view as someone who sits in the press box, but I'd like to hear the supporters' view at the moment on Eddie Howe. Please do give me your thoughts in the comments, and I'll try and reply to as many of them as possible. But going back to the Chelsea game in the meantime, I would expect changes to the starting lineup and a few to be rested for that game. You might see the likes of Voltemada come in for that game. You might see the likes of Wissa come in for that game. Just to give other players a rest as well. Anthony Gordon's an interesting one because, of course, he didn't really play a lot against Barcelona given his illness. But would you also want to keep him for the game at the Nou Camp, or do you want to get some minutes into his legs as well? That's an interesting one. I do think, as I say, changes will be made, but I'm just not entirely sure how many will be made against Chelsea. Chelsea, of course, are an interesting side. They can either be brilliant or terrible, a bit like Newcastle at the moment, it's fair to say. They were in a good position against PSG at one point last night. They were 2-2, of course, at the Parc des Princes, but then lost 5-2. A 3-goal disadvantage deficit is going to be a hard task for them to turn over at Stamford Bridge next week. So they're perhaps as good as out in the Champions League. So yeah, I think it's an interesting game. I do think Newcastle may struggle in this one, as I say, just because they'll be having an eye on other games to come. But you never know, and they will try and win it. Let's have a look at some of the comments. I'm stuck on the fence and still have been for several months. Sunderland is the game changer for me. Win and he's in, lose and he's out. I can understand that point of view. So, say I'll throw this one back to you. Say Eddie Howe wins against Barcelona, wins against Chelsea, wins against Barcelona, wins against Sunderland, loses against Chelsea. I presume that is absolutely fine with you if they get through against Barcelona and Sunderland, even though, yes, they're going to lose a Premier League game against Chelsea in that little run. If they beat Barcelona and beat Sunderland and then they attack the rest of the season in whichever way form it falls for them, that would be okay, I presume. Because for me, I can understand your point of view, but I think, if you lose against Chelsea but get through against Barcelona, I think that would be absolutely brilliant for Newcastle as a club. And in fact, let's get on to that Barcelona game now as well. Let's get on to it because we haven't got long left in the show and we need to preview that big game to come, of course, next Wednesday. And I think what we said there with Craig is that the tie is still very much alive. And also, Newcastle were probably the best performing English side of everyone who was left in the Champions League, because Arsenal drew against Bayer Leverkusen. They weren't that good. It was a penalty late on that saved it for them. Of course, as I've already mentioned, Chelsea were really, really poor against PSG. And then you've got Tottenham, poor against Atletico Madrid. Who am I missing? Liverpool, of course, lost against Galatasaray. You'd expect Liverpool to probably turn that round. You'd expect Arsenal to win as well. But I'd actually say that Newcastle have got a better chance than Chelsea and Tottenham of getting through. Now let's just go back into the comments. Sunderland is the do or die for Howe. Okay, guys, here's a question from your point of view. Would you rather, if you had to choose, beat Barcelona and get through the Champions League or beat Sunderland? So either win against Barcelona and lose against Sunderland, or lose against Barcelona and lose against Sunderland. Please do let me know your thoughts on that one. Another comment coming in from the Irish Toon Assassin. Would be funny if Newcastle beat Barca and were the only English team left in the Champions League. Well, it is possible. I don't think that'll be the case. I think Arsenal will go through, and I think Liverpool will probably go through as well. But I don't think Chelsea will, and I don't think that Tottenham will. I think they're both, I wouldn't say they're foregone conclusions, but they're perhaps as good as, barring miracles. Newcastle have got a good chance, I would say, in terms of getting through. So yeah, it's going to be tough at the Nou Camp. We all know this, but they've got every chance. They've got to go there with a positive attitude. They've got to do what they can. And I think they've got every chance. As I say, it's going to be tough. Barcelona are a good team, but Newcastle did make them look very, very ordinary at St James's Park. And if Lewis Hall can do another number on Lamine Yamal, if Tonali and Joe Linton and Ramsey can dominate the midfield of Pedri, etc., once again, and if they can somehow not have that tired little leg at the end, if they are holding on once again for a win, and see out a victory, it would be remarkable. Would it be the biggest away result in Newcastle's history if they did that, knocking Barcelona out at the last 16 of the Champions League at the Nou Camp to progress to the quarterfinals, where they will most likely face Atletico Madrid? Probably is the answer. Probably. Now, I must caveat saying I'm not travelling to Chelsea or Barcelona as a reporter, but for all the reporters that are there, I'm sure they'll have a great time and hopefully they'll cover a Newcastle win. Gaz has replied, let's have a look. We can't lose to Sunderland again. Any diehard Newcastle fan will never accept a defeat to your rivals, so lose to Barcelona is my answer. See, that's an interesting one. I completely, by the way, understand your point of view. Completely get it. But okay, I'll return the question to you guys. What game is more important for Newcastle as a club trying to progress? There's my question. Because I'm looking at this comment here from Irish Toon Assassin, and he says it would be world headline news if Newcastle beat Barcelona, and I completely agree with that statement. It would send shockwaves around the world, around European football, global football, if Newcastle were to knock out Barcelona in the Champions League. So what game is more important? And I get the diehard, but I completely get that. I do. I really get it, because let's be honest, Newcastle should be beating Sunderland. They should be. They have a better squad than them, and they are, of course, a side who's been in Europe. They've won a cup in recent years. Sunderland are a newly promoted side, but we should give credit to Sunderland. Sunderland have had a great season. But Newcastle, they should be beating them. But as I say, is the Barcelona game a more high-profile game? Probably, in my opinion. And would it do more for the club? Probably, in my opinion. That's not to say that I don't think they should, of course, not. I do think they'll beat Sunderland for the record. If they don't, it would be, quite disastrous for Newcastle if they were to have Sunderland do the double over them this season. Completely get that. But I'd like to hear your response, guys, on this one. And to say, is the Barcelona game a higher profile game that could do more for the club as a whole in terms of going forward? You've got the chance, therefore, of being in the last eight of the Champions League against Atletico Madrid, the revenue that would bring, and also Atletico Madrid, maybe you could argue, aren't as good as Barcelona, at least on paper. Football pitch is a different place, but on paper. So do you then have a chance of reaching a Champions League semi-final where you probably come up against Arsenal, you'd imagine, or even Bodo Glimt? It could well be Bodo Glimt. You'd imagine it would be Arsenal. But yeah, I'd like to know your thoughts on that one, because then you're in a semi-final against a side, let's be honest, a Premier League side who you could beat. So, and this is not me saying that Newcastle are going to make the final of the Champions League, because let's be honest, that is still a long, long way off, and a lot of things would have to happen and occur for that to be the case. But stranger things have happened. So yeah, I'd like to know your thoughts on that one. But anyway, my prediction for the game is that Newcastle would probably lose against Chelsea. I don't think it'll be a big loss, but I think they'll lose maybe 2-1. Barcelona at the Nou Camp. What do I think will happen? I honestly think Newcastle if they can put out a performance that they showed at St James's Park on Tuesday, they've got every right of going there and maybe getting a draw, taking it to extra time, and then we'll see what happens. Just before we get into my next bit, we do have a super chat coming in. Barca, bigger, bunny lad, Sunderland lower grade game. I sort of tend to agree a little bit, as I say, with what I've just said. I think Newcastle, that both games are more important than the Chelsea game, but such as the way Newcastle are at the minute, because they don't have that squad depth like a Man City, for example, or like an Arsenal, prioritising games is perhaps what they're going to have to do. That doesn't mean they won't try and win every game, because they will. But they may have to look at some games and think, okay, we'll have to make a few changes, we'll have to rest a few here and preserve them for the other games to come. Now, of course, if Newcastle do go out against Barcelona, they'll go hell for leather against Sunderland. So, yeah. Anyway, let's have a look at another comment. We would not see Arsenal into the final. Are Arsenal not on Newcastle's side of the bracket, Irish Toon Assassin? I'm pretty sure they were. I think if Newcastle were going to meet Arsenal, it would be on the semi-final. That's the only time that they could meet Arsenal is the semi-final, because they are on Newcastle's side of the bracket. If they got to the final, Newcastle, I'm gonna check that out, because I'm quite confident in what I'm saying. I mean, as I say, I could be completely wrong. Let me just check it out. UEFA Champions League, 25-26. I'm aware I'm running out of time here anyway, but let's just have a quick look at the bracket. The knockout phase. So if Newcastle were to win, they'd play Atletico Madrid at Tottenham. Yeah, I hate to break it to you, Irish Toon Assassin. If Newcastle were to beat Atletico Madrid or Tottenham, they would play the winner of Bodo Glimt, Sporting Lisbon, Bayer Leverkusen or Arsenal in the semi-final. So they could only meet Arsenal in the semi-final, and then it would be one of the other side of the bracket if they got to the final. But anyway, it's by the by. It doesn't matter, as I say. It would be Arsenal at some point. Anyway, and then just before we finish, let's have a look. The Barca game in terms of trying to move forward as a club, totally agree. But we need to remember we are as a club now, not that club. So yeah, that's fair point. Fair point, guys. Completely see where you're coming from. And that is perhaps a good way to end this show. So thank you all very, very much for listening and for watching. I hope you did enjoy the chat with Craig earlier and what he had to say about the games and the press conferences and the chats after those as well. But we'll be back next week with another episode of Inside the Press Room. But until then, please do continue to listen to NUFC Talk Radio and all the other great shows that are coming on the channel. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.